Here's a recently published article from the Grattan Institute putting forward an idea to help solve the worsening housing crisis in Australia. It was written by the Grattan Institute's Economic Policy Program Director, Brendan Coates. He states, "Home ownership is slipping out of reach for many younger, poorer Australians. Many older Australians who rent are also being left behind. A national shared equity scheme would help level the playing field. Whichever party wins the 2022 federal election should introduce a national shared equity scheme to help arrest declining rates of home ownership among poorer Australians of all ages." Here's the chart that shows the crisis unfolding. Since 1981, in all age groups, home ownership has been falling. In the 25 to 34-year-old age group, home ownership has plummeted from 1981, shown as circles, to 2016, shown as crosses, noting that 2016 is the latest data available, as the data from the most recent census, conducted in 2021, is not yet available, due to be released in June 2022. We can see that in the lowest income quintile, so the lowest 20% of earners, home ownership has plummeted from about 63% in 1981 to about 23% in 2016. I can only assume that this has gotten worse over the last 5 years. We can see that in all age categories, there have been significant falls in the lowest 20% of earners. It is certainly becoming hard to afford a house. Even among the richest Australians, those in the top 20% of earners, there has been measurable falls in home ownership. This can only mean that people's incomes are simply not keeping up with the cost of housing. Car ownership has been going up on average, TV ownership rates are going up, but housing ownership is going backwards. Is this not a national disgrace? And with interest rates set to rise, the problem is only going to get worse unless governments step in to help citizens secure access to the Australian dream. According to the article, the main reason home ownership is falling is because it takes much longer today to save for a deposit. In 1995, for example, it would take the average Australian about 7 years to save a 20% deposit for a typical dwelling. Now it takes almost 11.5 to 12 years. People have less income in relation to housing prices. If the house prices were lower, obviously it would be easier for people to save for a deposit. But even if house prices were to fall by, say, 20% from current levels, it would still take the average Australian about 9 years to save a 20% deposit on the average home. Many pensioners who rent live in poverty. For senior citizens who own their home outright, it should come as no surprise that less than 10% of them live in poverty. Those who are still paying off a mortgage are slightly worse off, especially those who live alone, but the poverty rate is still 15% or below. For those who rent, though, this data is very telling. More than 60% of pensioners who live alone and have to rent their accommodation are living in poverty. That's awful, isn't it? So many older Australians living in poverty. For some, it might be their own poor choices in life, but for many, it's probably not. They're just unlucky that they're living in a modern democratic country that continues to allow house prices and rents to skyrocket unabated. As mentioned in the article, home ownership shouldn't be the aim for everybody, but older Australians who don't own their home by the time they retire are often punished by the assets test for the age pension, which ignores housing equity but captures other savings in full, and rent assistance paid to pensioners that rent remains woefully inadequate. A shared equity scheme would help level the playing field for home buyers. A national shared equity scheme would help level the playing field for first home buyers and arrest the decline in home ownership among poorer Australians of all ages. Under the scheme I propose, the National Housing Finance and Investment Corporation would co-purchase up to 30% of the home value, taking a proportionate share of any profits when the home is sold. Purchasers would borrow the remaining funds from a private lender, provided they have at least a 5% deposit. Homeowners would also be able to buy out the government's equity stake in 5% increments at the prevailing market price. The NHFIC would not charge rent or interest to participants. Purchasers would be required to cover all costs associated with buying or selling a home, conveyancing, stamp duty, and ongoing costs such as council rates and maintenance. There'd be some restrictions such as it must be your principal place of residence, singles must have incomes below $60,000, couples must be below $90,000, and participants can only buy below median priced homes in their city or region. The scheme should start with a trial of 5,000 places a year for the first 3 years. Although several states already have such schemes, the federal government has lower borrowing costs than state governments and is much better placed than private providers to secure the long-term financing required to manage the scheme. It should be noted the goal of this scheme is not to reduce house prices. I guess even the Grattan Institute see that as politically unpopular. As noted in their 2018 report, Housing Affordability, Reimagining the Australian Dream, they state, "Fixing housing affordability is politically difficult. Improving housing affordability is a major policy challenge for Australian governments. Historically, governments have avoided the hard choices, preferring policies that merely appear to address the problem. The politics are difficult because many more people are homeowners than aspiring homeowners. In a typical year, roughly 100,000 people in Australia will become homeowners for the first time. They would benefit from any policy that leads to lower house prices. But at the same time, 5.4 million households already own at least one property. Policies that might result in lower house prices are not in their interests." Former Prime Minister John Howard famously remarked that people did not complain to him about the price of their house going up. But older generations do worry about whether their children and grandchildren will be able to buy a house. But basically, a sharp fall in house prices would not only be politically very unpopular, it would probably cause economic upheaval and do more harm than good. Anyway, back to the article. Shared equity schemes can result in higher house prices by adding to housing demand, but targeting schemes tightly at lower-income Australians and lower-priced homes would reduce the impact. The scheme would add at most $40 billion to housing demand in a $9 trillion housing market, and probably a lot less. So as I said, this scheme is not designed to make housing more affordable. It may even result in higher prices. But its goal isn't that. Its goal is to help people get into an already expensive housing market. Continuing, with regard to the effect on the government budget, a national scheme is likely to be budget positive in the long term, should nominal house prices rise faster than the interest rate on government debt to finance the purchases, as they have in the past. Existing state schemes, such as Western Australia's Key Start scheme, have typically turned a profit for state governments. But even if the federal and state government make the hard choices to improve housing affordability by lifting supply and reducing demand, house prices are likely to remain much higher relative to incomes than they have been over most of Australia's history. Falling home ownership is a big problem for Australia. A national shared equity scheme would help keep the dream of home ownership alive for many Australians. What do you think? Would this idea work? Would making it easier for people to get into an already expensive housing market be beneficial to Australia? I don't know, I have my doubts. Should we be focusing on getting people into an already inflated market, no matter what the cost? Or should we be focusing on making housing more affordable? I tend to think the latter.